Yeah. Yeah, that's a good segue into what we're going to talk about tonight. It does seem like the last few years, I think, not only personally, but for a lot of people, have been really, really hard. And that's kind of where this idea stemmed from on doing this series of, what do we do when we're in the wilderness? When it seems like everything's everything isn't making sense, but God is still there in the midst of that. And so that's what we're going to talk about tonight, and specifically that we serve a God who sees us and hears our pain and hears our cry, and he provides for every need. So we're going to open up to Genesis 16 tonight, and we're going to read the story of Sarai and Hagar. And so if you want to follow along, or you can listen to me read. So Genesis 16 says, Now Sarai, Abram's wife, was born with no children. She had a female Egyptian servant whose name was Hagar. And Sarai said to Abram, Behold, now the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Go into my servant. It may be that I shall obtain children by her. And Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. So after Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar the Egyptian, her servant, and gave her to Abram, her husband, as a wife. And he went into Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, she looked with contempt on her mistress. And Sarai said to Abram, May the wrong done to me be on you. I gave my servant to your embrace, and when she saw that she had conceived, she looked on me with contempt. May the Lord judge between you and me. But Abram said to Sarai, Behold, your servant is in your power. Do to her as you please. Then Sarai dealt harshly with her, and she fled from her. The angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness, the spring on the way to Shur. And he said, Hagar, servant of Sarai, where have you come from, and where are you going? She said, I'm fleeing from my mistress Sarai. And the angel of the Lord said to her, Return to your mistress and submit to her. The angel of the Lord also said to her, I will surely multiply your offspring so that they cannot be numbered for multitude. And the angel of the Lord said to her, Behold, you are pregnant and shall bear a son. You shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has listened to your affliction. He shall be a wild donkey of a man, his hand against everyone, and everyone's hand against him, and he shall dwell over against all his kinsmen. So she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her, You are a God of seeing. For she said, Truly have I seen him who looks after me. And then, therefore, the well was called Bir Lahai Roi. It lies between Kadesh and Bered. And Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram called the name of his son, whom Hagar bore, Ishmael. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore Ishmael to Abram. So there's a few big takeaways when reading this story in Genesis 16. Has anybody studied this story before? Hagar? Anybody heard of it before? Yeah, I'm sure I've read it, but it took me back to wow, I didn't really, it was one that I kind of just overlooked type. And so there's a couple takeaways that I really got from Genesis 16 and the story of Hagar. And the first is that God sees our suffering. So when we read this, we can see that Hagar was mistreated, right? She wasn't given the option. She was just a servant girl. And Sarai said, Here, Abram, take Hagar. She'll give you a child. And so she was, and then when she did get pregnant, Sarai mistreated her, right? She wasn't going to let her get away because she felt that feeling of that jealousy, right? That she had something that she really longed for and wanted, but yet it wasn't any fault to Hagar. And so now Sarai was mistreating Hagar. And so she felt alone, she felt afraid. And so she flees, doesn't she? And she finds herself in the desert where she encounters God at that spring. And God asks her one question when he meets her there. He says, where have you come from and where are you going? And she responds with just this simple phrase, I'm fleeing from my mistress. And maybe that's a shortened version of what she actually said. Maybe she spilled it all out to God and said, why have you done this? You saw what she was doing. but we see just that short little version of I'm fleeing from my mistress. Has anybody felt like that when something has happened to you before and you're like, I don't even know what to say, God, right? Like, I don't want what that is, whatever that is. But all she can say, all she can muster out is, I'm fleeing. I'm fleeing from that situation. And whatever Hagar did or didn't speak out loud, God heard her and saw right where she was at. And Hagar knew that, and she then calls to him El Roy, the God who sees me. And I've studied this a little bit this week, that she's the first one to give God a name. You know, God, throughout the Bible, he says who he is, but she names him El Roy, the God who sees me. Through her anguish and her wilderness, she truly felt that God had seen her. And if we look at what she just says, I'm fleeing. She doesn't answer the question to where I'm going. And have you ever felt like that, where like, you know for sure what you're fleeing from, but you don't know where you're going? You can't see the other side. You can't see the big picture. So you can tell God, I'm fleeing from whatever that is that I'm going through, but I can't even look past that. I can't see the big picture. I can't see where I'm going. And to me, it's a really cool picture that she's wandering, she's fleeing from the mistreatment, the loneliness, the anger, and she finds herself in the desert next to a spring of water. And she didn't know where she was going, but she ended up right where she was supposed to be. And that's exactly where God met her. And how often, I know for me, that I, even this week, was dealing with something, and I get to this place because just to be transparent, deal with anxiety sometimes. And I always am like, man, I don't want to be like that. I don't want to do that. Like, Lord, I don't want that on my life. But yet, when I revert back to that, like, I get so, what's the word? Like, down on myself that, like, man, I'm a Christian woman. Like, why do I have to struggle with that, Lord? And so, like, I feel like I get more hard on myself of, like, I don't want to be like that. I can't see what the bigger picture is, but yet, always, always, always does God meet me right where I'm at. And he's right there. The spring literally is right there. That doesn't matter the wilderness that you may be in. You might not be able to understand what's going on, but the spring is right there. And I think that's such a cool picture of how she didn't know where she was at, but God met her right there at that spring. And I think this story is so important for us to look at too, because God didn't super fix her problems, did he? He didn't say, I'm going to wipe it all clean, Hagar, I'm going to give you a new family. He didn't do any of that. He said, return to her and submit to her. So he sends her back to the situation to face it head on. And there's something so profound there because God sees what we're going through. He knows what we're going through. And sometimes we're left to face our troubles head on. Our hurts, our disappointments. Is it fun? No. But that doesn't mean that he has forgotten about us. And what we have to do is trust that he knows the bigger picture and that his promises are greater than our current situation. Isn't that right? And the next thing that I found really in this story that just really spoke to me this week is that God sees our value. And when you read the first few verses in chapter 16, when Abram and Sarai are talking to each other, they never mention Hagar by name. They only refer to her as servant or slave in some versions. But when she encounters God at the spring, the first thing out of his mouth is her name, Hagar. The first words out of his mouth are her name. And to Abram and Sarai, she was just a slave. She was just a servant girl. But to God, she was more important because she was known by him. And you might feel like that. Maybe you even feel like that today, like, man, I'm just the admin. I'm just the mom. I'm just the caretaker. I'm just the employee, whatever it is. Maybe you feel unseen, that you're just the worker, the handyman, but God knows you by name. He sees your value. And maybe you felt like Hagar, and the only time that they looked at you, or that people look at you, or people want to talk to you, people want you, is when they want something from you. Anybody ever felt like that? Like, man, the only time anybody ever picks up the phone to call me or send me a text is because they want something, right? It can be draining. But God knew her value, and he looked at her and said, Hagar. He called her by name. God sees exactly what you're going through too, and he calls you by name. He doesn't just look at you and think of you as fill in the blank, fill in your title, fill in whatever, but he looks at you and says, Abby, daughter of the king. Lindsay, daughter of the king. Right? He looks at us and sees us and calls us by name. And Hagar, she was astonished that God would see her and care for her. She was just a lowly servant girl. But she named him the God who sees me. And even in our most difficult circumstances, we can trust and we can see that God hears us when we cry out to him. Doesn't he? Yeah. He's compassionate and he's loving in his care for us. And, when I was looking through this and just really like asking God, what would you have us do? Like when we are struggling with whatever we're going through, like and maybe it's because I'm a kid's background person, but like I need to have like action behind something. I need to have it written out. I need to have the, what am I gonna do going forward? Like I don't want this just to be a time of like, oh, you just hear my voice and then you leave and then we come back next time. But like, what kind of follow through can we have? And so before we continue on, I just wanted us to spend a few moments tonight. Each time I'm gonna have these sheets. And so just some things for us to kind of break down Genesis 16 personally and what God is doing in your life. And then we'll end the time kind of more like having a share time. Is that okay? Okay, because I'm not like a super long time, because let's look at 7:24 and we still have a long time left together. So, but hopefully you got something a little bit out of it. And I have a little bit more, but I want us to do this first, or next.